3:17 a.m. February 1949. Lenox Avenue, Harlem. 30 businesses choked dead overnight, safes emptied. Credit buried. Not a single shot fired. Just one mafia banker's signature that strangled an entire neighborhood into silence. This wasn't bankruptcy. This was a calculated blockade designed to own Harlem without ever touching it. Bumpy Johnson saw it all and decided that banker would leave with nothing. 3:17 a.m. Nobody was awake to hear it happen. No explosion, no gunshot, no scream in the dark. Just a phone call somewhere on the Lower East Side. A few words spoken in Italian, and by the time the sun cracked over the East River, 32 businesses on Lenox Avenue had been quietly gutted while their owners slept. Marcus Webb was the first one to know something was wrong. He ran the fruit stand on the corner of 126th Street, had run it for 11 years. The man had opened that stand through blizzards, through riots, through 2 police raids that left the block smoking. But that Tuesday morning in February, he arrived at 6:30 a.m., reached for his supplier account to call in the day's order, and the line was dead. Not disconnected. Dead. Like it had never existed. He stood there in the cold with the receiver in his hand, and the only sound was the wind scraping a newspaper across the frozen pavement. By 7 a.m., the block smelled like panic. Not sweat exactly, something sharper. The smell of people who had walked to work in the cold and arrived to find nothing waiting for them. Workers standing outside dark storefronts, their breath coming out in white clouds. Nobody saying much. A pharmacist named Harold sitting on his front step holding a letter, reading it over and over like the words might change. His hands weren't shaking from the cold. The letter said his credit line had been suspended, effective immediately. No appeal. No explanation. Just a stamped seal from an office nobody in Harlem had ever heard of. Down the block, a grocery owner named Curtis was standing in his doorway staring at an empty delivery bay. His wholesaler hadn't shown. His calls weren't going through. He had $20 in the register and a neighborhood full of people who needed to eat. The underground bank on 128th, the one that had moved cash quietly through Harlem for 15 years, had its shutters down before 8 a.m. No sign, no word. Just a locked door where there had always been an open one. This was not a robbery. Robbers take what they can carry and run. Whoever did this had taken something you couldn't carry, the invisible machinery that kept an entire neighborhood breathing. Bumpy Johnson got the call at 6:52 a.m. He was already dressed, already drinking coffee that had gone cold, already awake in the particular way a man stays awake when something in the city has shifted and his bones register it before his mind can name it. Calvin came through the door of the diner on 125th without knocking, sat down hard across the booth, and laid it out flat. 32 spots, all hit the same way. Credit lines frozen, suppliers cut off, accounts locked. Nobody got a warning. Nobody knows who pulled the trigger. Bumpy didn't move. He looked out the window at Lenox Avenue and watched a delivery truck idle at the curb. The driver sitting on the hood with nowhere to go, smoking a cigarette that burned down to his fingers before he noticed. "Who holds the credit lines?" Bumpy said. "That's what nobody can figure out. Every trail dies at a shell company. No real name anywhere." Bumpy set his coffee cup down on the table. Slow. Deliberate. He had seen real panic before, the kind that erupts after a shooting, after a raid, after something sudden and violent. This wasn't that. This was surgical. Someone had spent months mapping every artery of Harlem's underground economy and had cut them all at once, cleanly, before sunrise, without leaving a single fingerprint. This wasn't desperation. This was a plan. "Start pulling every thread," Bumpy said. "I don't want the company name. I want the man behind the company. the actual human being who signed off on this. Calvin was gone before the coffee cooled. Bumpy walked outside. The cold hit him like a fist, the dry, bone-deep cold of a Harlem February that gets into your chest and stays there. He moved down Lenox slowly, watching. A woman in a good coat was crying quietly outside a locked dress shop, not bothering to wipe her face. Two men were arguing in hushed voices in front of a hardware store, both of them jabbing fingers at a piece of paper neither of them wanted to be holding. Darnell, who ran the liquor store on 127th, grabbed Bumpy's arm as he passed. "This kind of thing," Darnell said low, pulling him close enough that Bumpy could smell the fear on him. "It doesn't make it into the official reports. Whoever's behind this, they've done it before. To other neighborhoods. They know exactly how long it takes for people to break." Bumpy looked at him for a long second, said nothing. He kept walking. By noon, Calvin had traced 3 of the frozen credit lines back to the same shell company. By 2 p.m. he had found a bookkeeper, small man. Nervous hands, smelled like cigarettes and guilt who knew more than he wanted to admit. By 4 p.m. Bumpy had a name, an Italian banker, a man who had never once set foot in Harlem, had never needed to, because he had spent 18 months quietly buying up every financial lifeline the neighborhood depended on. Not the businesses, the suppliers, the invisible infrastructure beneath the visible world. And now he was tightening his fist. In this world, when the money stops first, everything else bleeds out after. Bumpy stood on the corner of 125th and Lenox and looked north up the avenue at the dark storefronts. The idle trucks, the people standing in the cold with nowhere to go, and felt something settle behind his eyes. Not rage. Something colder than rage. Something that required patience. He turned and walked back toward the diner. He had work to do. Vincent Caruso had never fired a gun in his life. He found them distasteful, loud, imprecise, the instrument of men who had run out of better ideas. In 61 years, Vincent had never needed to run out of better ideas. He had people for violence, layers of them, insulated from him by enough distance that no court and no enemy could ever draw a clean line from a body on the floor. Back to the man sitting at the desk on the Lower East Side with a view of the water and a cup of espresso going cold at his elbow. He was not a large man. He was not frightening to look at. He wore the same dark suit every day, kept his nails clean, spoke quietly, and only once. Men who worked for him developed the habit of leaning in when he talked, because he never raised his voice and he never repeated himself. His office smelled of paper and coffee and something faintly chemical, the smell of money handled so long it had soaked into the walls. He had been watching Harlem for 3 years. Not with hatred. Vincent Caruso didn't hate Harlem. He didn't feel much of anything about it. It was a market dense, cash-heavy, operating almost entirely outside the formal banking system, which meant it operated without the protections of that system, too. No lawyers, no regulators, no paper trails that led anywhere legitimate. Just handshake loans and neighborhood loyalty and debt enforced by reputation and fear. To Vincent, this was not a community. It was an open wound waiting for someone with the right instruments. For 18 months he had been buying. Not the businesses, the suppliers. The wholesalers who fed those businesses. The companies that delivered the flour to the bakeries, the medicine to the pharmacies, the liquor to the bars, the fabric to the seamstresses. He paid above market, which meant nobody asked questions. He spread the purchases across enough shell companies that no single person could see the full picture. Piece by piece. Quietly. He had bought the throat of Harlem. The freeze on February 4th was not cruelty. It was a demonstration. He needed the neighborhood scared enough to listen, desperate enough to sign. His representative, a man named Greco, was already moving through Harlem that morning with a briefcase full of new contracts that would make the nightmare disappear overnight. Restore every credit line, reopen every supplier account. All it cost was a signature. All it meant was that from that day forward, a percentage of every dollar made on those blocks would travel upward, silently, every month, forever. By noon, 3 owners had signed. 6 more were close. Sal called from a payphone on 126th to report in. His voice was flat, professional. "They're soft," he said. "Another day, maybe 2. The rest will fold." Vincent listened without responding for a moment. Then, "Good. And Johnson?" "Quiet so far. We don't think he has the resources to counter this." Vincent set down his espresso cup. "He doesn't," he said. "That's the point." He had done his homework on Bumpy Johnson. He respected the man's intelligence genuinely, in the way one competent operator respects another. But respect didn't change arithmetic. Bumpy's reserves were local. His power was relational. He had built his empire on loyalty and proximity, on being physically present in Harlem, on knowing every face and every debt. All of that was real. None of it was enough to fight a financial war against a structure backed by decades of accumulated capital, stretching from Manhattan to Palermo. Some records from this period were never made public, the kind of financial arrangements that existed in the margins between legitimate business and organized crime, documented nowhere except in the memories of the men who made them. Vincent told his associate that afternoon, very simply, "A gun takes one life. A debt takes a family's next 3 generations. I have always preferred the debt." He believed this completely. He had built his entire career on it. What he had not accounted for what his 3 years of surveillance, his 18 months of acquisition, his carefully constructed financial architecture had somehow failed to include was a specific variable, not a financial variable, a human one. Bumpy Johnson was not responding the way the model predicted. By the time Sal's second call came in that evening, the tone had changed. 2 of the 6 soft targets had gone hard. 3 businesses that should have been on the verge of collapse were still open. Somehow. Cash appearing from nowhere. Word was moving through the neighborhood, not panic, not submission. Something else. Something that smelled like resistance. Vincent sat with that information for a long time after he hung up the phone. He looked out at the water. The lights of Brooklyn reflected. Broken on the surface. "Find out where his money is coming from," he said finally. He was still not worried. Not yet. But something at the edge of his attention had shifted. The way a man who has spent decades trusting his instincts feels a small, cold current beneath the surface of a plan he thought was airtight. He poured a 3rd espresso. Across the river. Harlem had not broken. A gun only takes one life, but a debt takes everything a man ever built, and everything his children might have built after him. Vincent Caruso had built his empire on that truth. He was about to find out if Bumpy Johnson had built his on something stronger. Bumpy didn't sleep that night. Not because he was afraid. He had stopped being afraid of things years ago, or more accurately. He had learned to take the fear and compress it down into something hard and useful. The way pressure turns coal into something that cuts glass. He didn't sleep because there was no time for it, and because his mind was running numbers the way a machine runs numbers, cold and continuous, searching for the gap in a wall that looked, from the outside, completely solid. He had 12 businesses to save before morning, not 32. He had done the math quickly, the way he always did, ruthlessly, without sentiment. 12 were the ones that mattered, the ones that sat at the intersections of Harlem's underground cash flow, the places where money changed hands most often, most visibly, the barber shops where numbers runners checked in, the corner grocers where half the block ran credit tabs, the pharmacies, the diners, the small liquor stores that stayed open past midnight and kept the neighborhood's daily machinery lubricated. If those 12 stayed open, the neighborhood's confidence held. If confidence held, the other 20 had a reason to wait instead of surrender to Sal Greco's briefcase. If they folded, Harlem folded with them. And then Vincent Caruso walked in and picked the bones, so Bumpy opened his own money. He sent Calvin out with cash in a paper bag, not a briefcase, not an envelope. A brown paper bag like you'd carry groceries in, because the point was not ceremony. The point was speed. 3 of the 12 businesses got direct injections that night. No interest, no paperwork. One condition: stay open. Tell no one where it came from. He moved through the rest by phone and messenger, reaching people he'd done favors for over 15 years. Not asking. Reminding. There is a specific kind of conversation that happens in Harlem at 11 p.m. between men who have survived together, short, quiet, dense with meaning. You don't explain the whole picture. You say enough. The people who need to understand will understand. Then he sent Deacon. Deacon was not a large man either. He was medium height, medium build, the kind of man who could stand in a room for 10 minutes before anyone registered he was there. What made him valuable and slightly terrifying to people who knew him well was an absolute, preternatural stillness. He did not fidget. He did not fill silence with words. When Deacon sat down across from you in your own kitchen and accepted your coffee and looked at you, you understood very quickly and very completely that the man was not making a request. He visited 4 owners who had been approached by Sal Greco. He drank their coffee. He sat in their chairs. He said, with complete calm, "Mr. Johnson is aware of what's been offered to you. He's handling the situation. Anyone who signs before it's handled will find that operating in Harlem becomes considerably more difficult afterward. That's not a threat. It's a description of how things work." 3 of the 4 decided they could wait another day. The 4th had already signed. Bumpy got the news at midnight and said nothing for a long moment, standing in his office above the bar on 131st with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. He didn't punish the man. Couldn't afford to. Not because of sentiment, but because division was a luxury he didn't have. A frightened man signing a bad contract was not a traitor. He was a frightened man. There would be time to unwind the contract later. Right now, punishing him would send exactly the wrong message to everyone else who was scared and watching. Right now, Bumpy needed to look like he had this under control, even as the money drained out of him like blood from a wound. By 2 a.m. he was sitting at his desk, counting what remained. The numbers were honest and they were ugly. He had moved fast. He had moved smart. But Vincent Caruso's resources were not in the same category as his. Vincent had a machine behind him, decades of accumulated capital. Mafia infrastructure stretching from the Lower East Side to Brooklyn to places overseas that Bumpy had never seen and never would. The man could sustain this freeze for weeks, months if necessary. He had done it before, in other neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods had broken. The old men who remembered this period would say later that Bumpy moved through those days like a man who could see the whole map of the neighborhood's money at once, every debt, every obligation, every pressure point. Like he carried Harlem's financial nervous system inside his own chest. But even a man carrying a map runs out of road eventually. Bumpy lit a cigarette and sat in the blue smoke of his own office and thought about the bookkeeper. Specifically about one thing the man had said almost in passing. Nervous and rushing, trying to give Bumpy enough to satisfy him without giving too much. There was a ledger, a physical ledger, somewhere in Vincent's operation that contained names, not shell companies, Names. Real people. People in Harlem itself. Business owners, police contacts, politicians. And yes, almost certainly, some of Bumpy's own people who had been quietly feeding information to Vincent's network for months, helping him build the map that made this freeze possible. That ledger was the real weapon, not the frozen credit lines. Those were just the blade. The ledger was the hand holding it. If Bumpy could get to that ledger, he didn't need to beat Vincent financially. He just needed to make every person whose name was in it terrified of what happened when their neighbors found out. To keep a throne, you first keep the trust of the street, and Vincent Caruso had spent 18 months building a network inside Harlem that ran entirely on betrayal. Bumpy stubbed out his cigarette on the edge of the desk. His money was running thin. The banker's was not, but paper, the right paper, in the right hands, shown to the right people, could burn an empire to the ground faster than any gun ever had. The restaurant had no sign on the door. It sat on a side street 3 blocks east of Little Italy, the kind of place that existed entirely by word of mouth and existed for only one kind of customer. No tourists, no walk-ins. The windows were painted black from the inside, and the only light visible from the street was a thin yellow line under the front door, like something burning slowly in a sealed box. Bumpy arrived at 9 p.m. exactly. He had dressed carefully, not to impress, but to communicate. Dark suit, no jewelry, no weapon visible. He wanted Vincent Caruso to look across the table and see a man who had come to talk business, not to beg and not to threaten. The distinction mattered. In the world both men inhabited, how you walked into a room told the other man everything he needed to know about how desperate you were. Bumpy walked in like he owned the floor. A man in a white shirt led him through the dining room, empty. Every table set and unoccupied. Silverware gleaming under dim chandelier light, to a private room in the back. The room smelled of garlic and candle wax and cigarette smoke ground into 40 years of wallpaper. A single table, 2 chairs, a bottle of wine already open. Breathing. Vincent Caruso was already seated. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to destroy something. Small, neat, still. His hands rested flat on the white tablecloth. His eyes tracked Bumpy across the room with the patient, measuring quality of a man who had spent 60 years watching other men walk through doors and calculating precisely how much they were worth. Bumpy sat down. For a moment, neither man spoke. The waiter poured wine and disappeared so fast it seemed like the room had simply absorbed him. And then the silence settled thick, pressurized, the kind of silence that has weight you can feel against your eardrums. Somewhere in the restaurant, a clock ticked. That was the only sound. The waiter would say later, to anyone who asked, that he had never worked a table that quiet in 30 years, like sitting outside a room where someone was deciding whether to pull a trigger. "You came alone," Vincent said finally. Statement, not question. "So did you," Bumpy said. Vincent almost smiled. Almost. Bumpy leaned forward slightly and laid it out clean. No preamble, no flattery, no performance. He told Vincent he understood what had been built: the supply chain acquisitions, the credit network, the months of groundwork. He told him he respected the construction of it. He told him he was not there to pretend it hadn't worked, because it had worked, and both of them knew it. "But you're trying to take Harlem from the outside," Bumpy said, "and Harlem doesn't work that way. You can freeze every credit line on the avenue and people will find another way. They always have. You'll spend 2 years grinding, and at the end of it you'll have a neighborhood that hates you and a network that costs more to maintain than it earns." He paused. "Let it breathe. Split the operation. 50-40 in your favor. You keep the supply infrastructure. I keep the street relationships. Together it runs clean. Against each other. We both bleed. Vincent picked up his wine glass, turned it slowly, set it back down without drinking. You came here to offer me 40% of something I already own, he said. His voice was completely flat. Not angry, not amused. Flat in the way a man's voice gets when he has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the conversation to finish. You've been running on reserves for 4 days, Vincent continued. I know exactly how much you moved and where you moved it. I know which businesses you propped up and which ones you couldn't reach. I know you haven't slept. And I know that the men whose names are in my book, men you've trusted for years, have been feeding me information since October. He let that land. Bumpy didn't move. Not a muscle. His face was stone, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something that Vincent, watching carefully, registered as confirmation of a wound. You don't have a negotiating position, Vincent said. You have a delay, and delays end. He picked up his wine, drank this time. Go home, Mr. Johnson. When your people have finished breaking, send someone to talk to Sal. He'll give them fair terms. Bumpy sat for 3 more seconds, long enough that the silence became uncomfortable even for Vincent. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and said one sentence. I hope you remember this conversation clearly, because you're going to want to understand exactly where everything went wrong. He walked out through the empty dining room, past the gleaming silverware, past the candles burning down in their holders, and out the front door into the cold. Vincent sat alone at the table for a long moment after the door closed. Then he picked up the phone and told Sal to freeze 8 more businesses by morning. When an opponent thinks you've already lost, that is the exact moment the real game begins. He was still not worried. He should have been. The bookkeeper's name was Ellis Frome. He was 53 years old, lived alone in a 2-room apartment on 133rd Street, and had been processing financial paperwork for Vincent Caruso's Harlem operation for 11 months without fully understanding, or so he told himself, what he was actually part of. He was the kind of man who had learned to keep his head down so completely that he had developed a talent for not seeing things directly in front of him. But he had kept copies, not out of courage, out of fear, the specific fear of a small man who understood that if everything went wrong, he would be the first one fed to whatever came looking. The copies were insurance, 11 months of transaction records, correspondence, and most importantly, 1 photograph of a page from the ledger that Sal Greco carried in his briefcase and never let out of his sight. Calvin brought Ellis to Bumpy at 2 a.m. on February 8th. The apartment smelled like burnt coffee and old newspaper. Ellis sat at his kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking from. And he talked for 40 minutes while Bumpy sat across from him and said almost nothing. Just listened. Just let the man empty himself out. The ledger was worse than Bumpy had expected. Not the financial data that he had already reconstructed in his head from the pieces Calvin had pulled together over 4 days. The money was almost secondary. What made the ledger dangerous? What made it the kind of document that changes the temperature of a room just by existing? Were the names. 14 names. Police. 3 of them, including a Lieutenant Bumpy had paid for protection for 6 years. A man who had sat at Bumpy's table, eaten his food, taken his money every month like clockwork, and apparently spent those same months feeding Vincent Caruso the precise details of how Harlem's underground economy was structured, where the pressure points were, which operators could be flipped, and which ones would need to be simply bypassed. 4 Harlem businessmen, 2 of whom Bumpy had personally kept alive financially during lean years. Men who owed him in the way that Harlem men owed each other, not just money, but loyalty. History. The kind of debt that doesn't get written down because it doesn't need to be. And 3 names that hit Bumpy somewhere deeper than anger. Men from his own operation, Not peripheral people, not runners, not street-level workers who could be excused for not understanding the full picture. Senior men, men who knew schedules, cash movements, the identities of suppliers Bumpy had spent years cultivating, the locations of reserves he kept off the books specifically because he trusted only 3 people alive to know about them. Ellis slid the photograph across the table. Bumpy looked at it for a long time without touching it. The worst part, the part that sat in his chest like a swallowed piece of glass, was a column on the right side of the ledger page that Ellis pointed to with a trembling finger. Transaction codes. Cross-referenced against a separate sheet Ellis hadn't been able to photograph but had memorized enough of to explain. A portion of the cash that had flowed through Bumpy's own collection network over the past 8 months had been quietly siphoned small amounts. Irregular intervals. Nothing large enough to trigger notice into accounts that fed directly into Vincent's acquisition fund. The money Bumpy had used to build his own power had partially financed the instrument being used to destroy him. He had fed the machine that was eating him. Bumpy stood up from the table and walked to the window. Stood there with his back to Ellis for a full minute, looking out at the dark street below. A cat moved across a patch of lamplight and disappeared. Nothing else moved. "How many people know this ledger exists?" he said finally. "Sal knows. Vincent knows. Me." Ellis paused. "And now you. Where is the physical ledger right now?" "Sal keeps it. It goes everywhere he goes. Vincent made that rule specifically. Nothing gets left in an office. Nothing gets stored anywhere it can be found. Sal carries it because Sal is the only one Vincent trusts to not lose it." Bumpy turned around. He looked at Ellis for a moment, really looked at him. The way Bumpy looked at things when he was deciding their usefulness, and said, "You're going to stay in this apartment. You're not going to contact anyone. In 3 days this is either over or you have much larger problems than Vincent Caruso." Ellis nodded. His hands were shaking badly enough now that coffee would have spilled. Bumpy picked up the photograph from the table and put it in his coat pocket. He walked out into the hallway, and Calvin fell into a step beside him without being asked. "The 3 names from our side," Bumpy said quietly as they moved toward the stairs. "I want them separated from everything sensitive starting tonight. No explanation. Just move them sideways where they can't see anything that matters. And then I need to get that ledger away from Sal." He pushed through the stairwell door. The biggest mistake a man can make is spending years building a system and never checking whether that system has learned to feed on him. The ledger wasn't just a record of Vincent's network. It was a map of every betrayal that had made that network possible. And betrayal. Bumpy understood with absolute clarity as he walked out into the February cold, was not a financial weapon. It was a social one. You didn't win by destroying Vincent Caruso. You won by making sure every person in Harlem knew exactly whose names were in that book. Sal Greco made one mistake. He was a careful man, careful in the way men become careful when they have spent 20 years working close to violence and survived by paying attention to details other people dismissed. He varied his routes. He kept his phone calls short. He never met anyone in the same location twice. He treated the ledger in his briefcase like a religious object. Something to be protected not because anyone had told him to, but because he understood instinctively what it represented. His mistake was the woman on 129th Street. Her name was Della. She ran a hat shop that had been in her family for 30 years. Sal had been stopping in twice a week since October, not for business, just for coffee and conversation. The particular comfort a man finds in a place where nobody knows what he actually does. Della made strong coffee and didn't ask questions and had a laugh that filled the whole shop. Sal had told himself it was harmless. Bumpy had known about Della since November. He had never used it. had filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept things that might matter later. The careful inventory of human vulnerabilities that every man in his position maintained like a second set of books. He hadn't needed it until now. On the morning of February 9th, Della told Sal that a man had come into her shop the previous evening, asking questions about her lease, specifically about whether she was aware that her building had recently been acquired by a holding company, and that her rent would be increasing significantly, starting the 1st of March. She was frightened. She didn't understand what was happening. She needed to talk to someone who might know how these things worked. Sal left his briefcase under the counter while he made calls from the back room to find out if this was real or a misunderstanding. It took 11 minutes. When he came back, the briefcase was exactly where he had left it. He checked the ledger immediately, the habit of a careful man, and it was there. Undisturbed. Every page in order. What Sal did not know, could not have known, was that Calvin had been in that back room 4 minutes before him. That Calvin had a man who could photograph 40 pages in under 8 minutes using equipment that had cost Bumpy more money than he wanted to think about. That every name, every transaction code, every cross-reference in Vincent Caruso's most sensitive document now existed as a second set of images locked in a box on 131st Street. Bumpy held the copies in his hands that afternoon and thought for a long time about how to use them. The obvious move was confrontation. Take the names to the people named. Let them know their exposure. Watch them scramble. But obvious moves in this kind of war created unpredictable reactions. Frightened people did stupid things. Stupid things got people killed. And dead people created police attention that Bumpy did not need right now. He needed something slower, cleaner, more precise. He started with the financial infrastructure. The first thing he did was get word to 6 of Vincent's smaller debtors' men who owed money to the network, but whose loyalty to it was purely transactional. He didn't threaten them. He simply made sure they received, through separate, untraceable channels, specific details about transactions in the ledger that involved their accounts. Details that suggested their money was being used in ways they hadn't consented to. Details that raised questions about whether the man they owed was actually keeping accurate records of what they'd paid. 2 of them stopped paying immediately. 1 demanded an accounting that Sal couldn't provide without revealing more than he wanted to. The 3rd went to a lawyer. Then Bumpy moved on the paperwork. Several of Vincent's supply contracts, the ones that gave him control over Harlem's wholesalers, depended on documentation filed with 3 specific intermediary companies. Bumpy had spent 4 days identifying the individuals inside those companies who were not ideologically committed to Vincent's network, who were simply employees doing their jobs and cashing checks. Through methods that left no trail, anyone later was able to fully reconstruct. Certain documents developed problems, discrepancies, missing signatures, dates that didn't align with delivery records. Nothing criminal on the surface, just bureaucratic friction. The kind of friction that makes a supplier nervous. The kind of friction that makes a man say, quietly, to his business partner over lunch, "I'm not sure this account is as solid as we thought." By February 11th, the word moving through the back channels of Harlem's underground economy was quiet but consistent. The banker's money might not be as safe as it looked. His network might have exposure nobody fully understood yet. Men who had been considering Sal's contracts were suddenly finding reasons to wait. Police records from that week would later note that numerous transactions from the period were simply unverifiable, a phrase that covered a great deal without explaining anything. On February 12th, Vincent Caruso made his first direct call to Bumpy's line. He did not identify himself. He didn't need to. He said, very quietly, "This is a mistake you won't be able to walk back." Bumpy said, "I'm not walking anywhere. I'm standing right here." The line went dead. Vincent knew now, knew it was Bumpy, knew the disruption was deliberate and coordinated, knew that whatever had seemed like a manageable delay 4 days ago had become something with teeth. The ledger photograph was somewhere he didn't know where, didn't know how much had been captured, didn't know who had seen it or what Bumpy intended to do with it, and not knowing was the point. A financial empire dies fastest when trust dies first, and trust, once it starts bleeding, doesn't clot on its own. Vincent had built his entire operation on the assumption that he was the one with the information advantage, that he knew Harlem better than Harlem knew him. He was beginning to understand that he had been wrong about that. And in this business, being wrong about one thing had a way of making you wrong about everything else too. Vincent Caruso stopped asking nicely on February 13th. The black Cadillac appeared on the corner of 126th and Lenox at 7 a.m. engine running. 2 men inside, not even pretending to be something other than what they were. They sat with the particular stillness of men who had done this before, in other neighborhoods, in other cities, and knew exactly how long it took for a street to break when you applied the right kind of pressure to it. By noon there were 4 cars. By evening, 7. Not police, not local muscle. These men came from Brooklyn, and everyone on Lenox Avenue who had lived long enough understood what Brooklyn muscle meant. It meant Vincent Caruso had stopped trying to win quietly and had decided to simply crush whatever was left of the resistance and pick through the rubble at his leisure. The second move came from Carver. Lieutenant Carver showed up at a distribution point on 128th at 6 a.m. on February 14th, with 8 uniforms and a battering ram he didn't need because the door was unlocked. His men went through the place like they were looking for something specific, pulling drawers out onto the floor, overturning shelves, pushing 3 of Bumpy's workers against the wall with their hands locked behind their heads. Neighbors watched from windows. Children on their way to school stopped on the sidewalk and stared. Nothing illegal was found. Nobody was charged. That was never the point. The point was the sound of it. The point was the sight of it. The point was the word moving through Harlem by 8 a.m. that Bumpy Johnson's operations were being hit, that his people were being put against walls in public, that whatever protection he had built over 15 years was visibly, loudly crumbling. 2 more raids hit by noon. Same template, same theatrics, same nothing found. Bumpy heard about the first one while it was still happening. He was at a counter on 130th, eating eggs that tasted like cardboard, when Jerome came through the door, breathing hard, and leaned down and set it low and fast into his ear. Bumpy picked up his fork, took 1 more bite, chewed it slowly, paid his check, walked out, because 3 people at that counter were watching him. And the way a man stands up from a table when he gets bad news is the first thing a neighborhood reads. The next 4 hours were the most dangerous of his life, and he spent all of them moving. He scattered everything. Cash reserves broken into 11 pieces and moved to 11 locations nobody had used before. His senior people dispersed to separate safe houses with instructions to communicate only through a rotation of intermediaries he had set up that morning and told nobody about in advance. He was dismantling and rebuilding his own network in real time, 1 step ahead of the men trying to find the edges of it. The streets felt like a held breath. Shopkeepers pulled their gates halfway down during the day. Women walked faster and kept their eyes forward. The delivery trucks that had started returning to the block after Bumpy's initial stabilization effort disappeared again. Drivers making the rational calculation that a neighborhood with 7 black Cadillacs on its corners was not a neighborhood where you wanted your truck to be known. At night, the sounds changed in a way that people who lived through it never forgot. It wasn't sirens. It wasn't shouting. It was footsteps on staircases, slow, deliberate, pausing at landings. The sound that might be a neighbor coming home late or might be something that had no good answer if you opened your door to find it. Several residents kept knives in their kitchen drawers that week who had never done so before. Some things about those nights were never written into any report, but the people on those blocks carried the memory of them for the rest of their lives. Bumpy lost 2 operations on February 15th to something harder to fight than raids. Fear. 2 operators who had been with him for years simply went dark. No calls, no contact, no explanation. They had looked at the math, the cars, the raids, the visible shrinking of Bumpy's footprint, and made a private decision about which side of a line they wanted to be standing on when this finished. Bumpy noted it without anger. Fear was not a moral failure. Fear was information about how much time he had left. Calvin found him at 10 p.m. in the back room of a barber shop on 132nd. Bumpy was sitting in the barber's chair with his coat still on, eating a cold sandwich, running numbers in the silence. 40% down across everything, Calvin said. Operations, people, cash flow, in 10 days. I know. Vincent's people are telling the street it's finished, that you're days away from gone. Good. Bumpy set the sandwich down. I need him to believe that. Calvin looked at him for a long moment. The barber shop smelled of pomade and old leather, and the specific dusty warmth of a small room that has held a lot of human tension over the years. Vincent has to move his reserve, Bumpy said. Brooklyn put real money into this. Brooklyn is watching. In the next 72 hours, Vincent needs to show them the money is there. Liquid. Real. Accessible. He needs to perform solvency for people who are starting to doubt it. And you know where it moves. I know where it has to go, which is enough. He stood up, rolled his neck once. The joint cracked in the quiet like a small gunshot. The bigger the power a man builds, the closer the bill for it gets, and one day it arrives all at once. Harlem was 4 days from becoming a battlefield. Not between criminals, between the idea of what this neighborhood was and the machinery trying to turn it into a balance sheet. People who had nothing to do with any of this were going to get hurt if it went another week. That was the clock, not Vincent's patience, not Brooklyn's timeline. The people on those sidewalks who didn't know any of their names. Bumpy buttoned his coat. 72 hours, he said, then we finish it. The transfer was set for February 17th at 11 p.m. $200,000 in cash, moving from a holding location in Lower Manhattan to a counting house in Brooklyn. This was Vincent's proof of life, the liquidity demonstration that would satisfy Brooklyn's representatives and confirm that the Harlem operation was real, was producing, was worth the muscle and the money they had committed to it. Bumpy knew the details because of a chain of people so long and so carefully insulated from each other that pulling it apart afterward would have been nearly impossible. A driver who knew a woman who had a brother. 3 human links between Vincent's inner logistics and a piece of paper that reached Bumpy's hands 48 hours before the transfer was scheduled. He did not plan a robbery. The obvious move was an ambush, hit the transfer. Take the money. Send Vincent home empty. But that move brought guns, and guns brought bodies, and bodies brought a law enforcement response that would have torn Harlem open at the seams. The people Bumpy was fighting for would have paid the price for a victory that only served him. He planned something colder. For 48 hours, he worked the edges of Vincent's network with the focused patience of a man dismantling a building, one load-bearing wall at a time. The 6 debtors he had been cultivating received their final packages, documentation pulled directly from the ledger photographs, specific and accurate to the dollar, showing exactly how their accounts had been skimmed without authorization. Not by the amounts they knew about, by additional amounts, smaller and irregular, drawn against their balances in a pattern that only became visible when laid out in sequence. 3 froze their payments immediately. 2 called lawyers. 1 called a man in Brooklyn who was already asking questions about the Harlem timeline. And that man's questions became louder and more specific in a way that reached Vincent at 6 p.m. on February 17th, like a hand closing around his throat. Vincent was already stretched thin. He had 4 problems running simultaneously, and was managing all of them from his desk with the controlled intensity of a man who has operated at this level for decades and still feels the weight of it in his hands. The call from Brooklyn asking him to confirm the reserve balance hit him at the worst possible moment. He told his associate to verify immediately. The verification came back wrong. $32,000 distributed across 3 sub-accounts in a configuration that could not be explained quickly to men who were already nervous. Not missing, not obviously stolen, just wrong in the specific way that makes suspicious men more suspicious, like something had been moved and then partially moved back. Like someone had been inside the architecture of the numbers and rearranged them just enough to create doubt. Brooklyn pulled its men at 9 p.m. 2 calls to Sal went to silence. 1 call to Carver went to silence. The Cadillacs that had sat on Harlem's corners for 5 days like a occupying army were simply gone by 10 p.m. there and then not there, leaving nothing behind except the memory of their exhaust and the ghost of the fear they had planted. Bumpy got the word from Calvin at 10:15. He was in the kitchen of a ground-floor apartment on 134th that existed in no record connected to his name. He was drinking water. He had not slept more than 3 hours in 4 days, and his eyes were the particular dry and steady eyes of a man running entirely on will. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then, and the reserve. Vincent's people went to verify it this morning. Calvin paused. Some of the accounts look like they've never been touched, like the numbers were always just numbers on paper. The transfer never happened. The money never moved. And when Vincent's people tried to establish the actual balance across his Harlem holdings, they found an accounting situation so thoroughly complicated by disputed records and missing documentation that untangling it would take weeks of work by people who were no longer returning his calls. Someone who was there the morning they opened the counting house said the ledgers looked like rooms that had been carefully furnished and then emptied overnight, everything in the right place except the thing that was supposed to be there. The cruelest thing you can do to a powerful man is not take what he has. It is to make him stand in front of the people who believed in him and let them watch the power drain out of his hands while everyone is looking. Vincent Caruso was not arrested, not touched, not publicly humiliated in any way he could point to or respond to. He simply became, in the space of one night, a man whose word no longer carried the weight it had carried the day before, in the world he lived in. That was worse than dying. Sal Greco was on a train out of New York within the week. Carver put in for a transfer to Queens and got it in 48 hours, which told you everything about who had helped facilitate the request. The man who had strangled Harlem with a signature sat in his office and looked at the water and understood. For the first time in 61 years of operating at the highest levels of organized money, what it felt like to have nothing left to move. Marcus Webb opened his fruit stand at 6:47 a.m. on February 19th. He did it quietly. No ceremony. No announcement, just the sound of the metal gate rolling up in the cold morning air. A sound that carried half a block in each direction and landed on the ears of the people walking to work, like something they hadn't realized they'd been waiting to hear. He stacked his oranges. He set his coffee thermos on the corner of the stand. He stood behind it with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the block. By 7:36, more gates were up. By noon, 26 of the 32 businesses that had gone dark on February 4th were open, their registers running, their suppliers delivering, their lights on. The pharmacist Harold had his prescription line moving again. The seamstress. Ruth had 3 customers waiting when she unlocked her door. The grocery on 127th had a line that stretched 4 people onto the sidewalk. People buying things they didn't urgently need because the act of buying was itself the point proof that the machinery still worked, that the block was still theirs, that whatever had tried to take it had failed. The air smelled different. Coffee and exhaust and cold bread and the specific animal warmth of a neighborhood that has been holding its breath for 2 weeks and is finally letting it out. Bumpy had spent the 48 hours after Vincent's collapse moving on 2 tracks simultaneously, without sleeping. The first track was the infrastructure. His people contacted every supplier, every credit intermediary, every wholesale account that Vincent's network had controlled. The message was identical each time, delivered in person, face to face. No documents changing hands in that initial conversation. The previous arrangement is finished. New terms are available. The terms are fair and they are guaranteed by Bumpy Johnson personally. Most suppliers came back within hours. A few negotiated. None walked away. The new system was cleaner than what had existed before. More structured. Clearer lines of accountability. Specific protections against the kind of single-point acquisition that had made the February freeze possible. Bumpy had spent the worst nights of the past 2 weeks thinking about exactly where the old system's vulnerabilities were, and building the new one around the absence of those vulnerabilities. It was, by almost any measure, better designed. It also ran entirely through him. The second track was the ledger. He did not publish the names, did not hold a meeting or make a speech or use the information as a public hammer. He sent personal messages to all 14 names, each one delivered by hand, each one brief and identical in its essential content. I have it. You know what it means. What comes next is your choice. The 3 men from his own operation were gone within a week. He had made a deliberate decision about their fate that cost him something. He didn't examine too closely. Men who had sat at his table, taken his money, eaten his food, and fed his most sensitive information to a man trying to destroy him. The cold mathematics of the situation argued for something permanent. The longer mathematics of what he was building argued against it. Dead men created investigations, and investigations created exposure, and exposure was the one thing he couldn't afford right now. He made them understand that their survival depended on their disappearance. They disappeared. The police lieutenant transferred himself to the Bronx within 10 days. Bumpy made one phone call to someone who owed him a favor to ensure that transfer was processed quickly and without scrutiny. The businessmen who had fed Vincent information came back into the fold. They came back understanding exactly what Bumpy held, and exactly what their continued operation in Harlem was contingent on. This was not forgiveness. It was a leash. And everyone involved knew the word for what it was. The new credit system went live on February 22nd. Bumpy held a dinner on 125th Street that last week of February. The neighborhood's significant operators, all present. All seated at a long table in a private room above a restaurant that smelled of red sauce and candle wax. He sat at the head. He ate. He listened to the conversation around him with the relaxed attention of a man who already knows every answer in the room and is simply waiting for the right questions. When he spoke, the table went quiet before he finished his first word. He told them the system was new and it was solid, and it was going to work because everyone in that room was going to make it work. He told them the terms were fair. He told them what happened if the terms weren't honored, not with anger, not with volume, but with the flat, clinical specificity of a man describing a natural process. Rain falls. The sun rises. These are the consequences. Nobody at that table asked a clarifying question. The people who lived through the February freeze tell the story differently, depending on what they saw and how close they were to the center of it. Some details were never made part of any formal record, the kind of events that exist only in the memories of the people who were present and in the careful silences of those who weren't but knew anyway. But everyone agrees on one thing. Harlem came out of it alive. Businesses open, people fed, streets intact, no war, no bodies in the gutter. Whatever Bumpy Johnson had done in those 16 days, the neighborhood was standing at the end of it. Marcus Webb asked how he felt on that first morning his stand was open again. looked up the avenue for a moment before he answered. "Like we survived," he said. "I'm just not sure yet what we survived into. In the underworld, freedom is almost never what it looks like. Usually it is just the space between one owner and the next, a few days of open air before a new door closes. And by the time you hear the lock, you're already inside." Bumpy walked out of the dinner at midnight and stood on 125th Street in the February cold, looking north up Lenox Avenue. The lights were burning. The gates were up. The block was breathing. He had saved Harlem. He had also, with the patience and precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, made it entirely his. He turned his collar up and walked into the dark and didn't look back. The blockade ended, but Harlem didn't go back to what it was. The locks came off. The businesses breathed again. Vincent Caruso disappeared from the board without a trial, without a headline, without a single official record naming what had actually happened. The streets looked the same. The lights stayed on. The coffee was hot in the morning, but the invisible architecture underneath all of it had been rebuilt closer, tighter, and belonging to one man in a way it never had before. Bumpy Johnson saved Harlem in February 1949. That part is true. What's harder to sit with is the other part, that the neighborhood he saved never again operated outside his shadow. Sometimes the man who pulls you out of the fire is the same man who decides what you owe him for it. If stories like this are what you come here for, the ones that don't make the textbooks, the ones that lived in back rooms and closed files and streets that never slept, then stay close. There are more where this came from, and the next one cuts just as deep. One question before you go. If you were a Harlem business owner in 1949, would you have signed Vincent's contract, or held out and trusted Bumpy? And when it was over, did Harlem get rescued or just traded to a different owner? Leave your answer below. These conversations are half the reason we keep digging.